Okay, if you are one of my very few subscribers, be prepared to be bored by my notes for my Old Testament exam. We're going to start at the beginning with the narrative, or their story. So the Exodus narrative formed the major foundation for Israel as a people. This narrative, combined with the primeval prologue, possibly written at a later time, and the ancestral narratives from a foundational communal narrative, form a foundational communal narrative for a nascent people or developing people. They were oppressed, but they became liberated when they were exiled, or not exiled, when they went through the Exodus out of Egypt. A significant aspect of this story was the honour of Yahweh. We see, for example, Moses saying, "Lord, if you do not save these people, the nations around you will say that you took them out of Egypt and allowed them to die because you were not able to bring them into your promised land." So the deliverance was never an end in itself, but a beginning of a new life in the promised land. So a key concept of the remembrance was the narrative, especially the Exodus, and we see recommendation to celebrate Passover throughout the millennium, shall we say. All right, their moral ethical framework was called the Torah. Their framework scaffolded their emergence as a people. This framework was a reflection of Yahweh's self and an aspiration for a covenant people. It explicitly identified the expectations God had for a covenant people and marked the boundaries of the relationship between suzerain, or king, which is God, and the vassal, who is the conquered people, the Israelites. The laws constituting the moral ethical framework offered principles and rubrics which were familiar to an ancient Near East people, but unique in particular ways from surrounding cultures. For example, they worshipped only one God. They did not sacrifice their children. Okay, well, let's get on to their worship, their devotion, or their worship. Yahwistic people were called to worship in a particular way, as spoken of in the Torah. Their mode of worship was to reflect the covenant relationship already set in place. The modes of worship were contextual to ancient Near East culture and yet distinct in creative ways. So I previously mentioned sacrifice. They still offered sacrifices like the other ancient Near East people, but they did not sacrifice their children like many of them did. They would only sacrifice animals. Although existing in a self-evidently polytheistic milieu, the people were called to be Yahwistic. God frequently was upset at their willingness to go off after other gods for worshipping the high places, offering sacrifices and burning incense to other gods. Yahwistic worship should have been just to the one God, to Yahweh. Now their centre, which was the tabernacle in the desert, and then the temple in the promised land. The tabernacle and later the temple were a symbolic representation of God's glory or his presence. They were to remind people of who they were to be centered around. While the tabernacle and temple were in a sense mythical, they were not meant to be viewed as magical. We see them taking the tabernacle into battle against the Philistines, and the tabernacle, or the whole Ark of Covenant, is taken away, a key part of the tabernacle. It wasn't magic. It didn't help them win the war, but it was a key part of their worship. The symbolism of God's presence in the tabernacle was moving, and then in the temple, stationary, which were both to be significantly challenged in the exile, when the symbolism of God's presence was no longer with them. Their place, the land, the possession of the land was historically a culmination of the movement from oppression to liberation. This possession was a gift from Yahweh rather than a right to be exercised by the people, under the principle of the Jubilee, which I have to look into. The land had provided these nomadic and homeless people with a sense of place. As with the tabernacle and temple, these people had transitioned from nomadic to settled people, which presented sociological, psychological, and theological challenges. Yeah, I can't think of really many. Theologically, I guess they were much more able to be influenced by the pagan nations around them than when they were wandering through the deserts and not forming relationships with nearby cultures, or at least not as stronger relationships. They weren't able to marry when they were in the desert, although they were forbidden to even when they entered the land. They still did. So finally, we work our way up to their leadership, or the monarchy, starting under Saul, and then into David and Solomon and beyond. Although monarchy was foreshadowed in Deuteronomy, it was not without cautions. Once it emerged, monarchy walked a fine line between faithfulness to Yahweh and outright rejection of the people's divine debt. We see with Saul. Saul initially was trying to follow God, but then he had also moments of going off and doing his own thing and became quite hostile to the will of God because he was at war against David and he did not live up to the expectations that God had for him as a leader of his people. Yahweh allowed and then blessed monarchy, but presumably as a second best option, as it is implicitly indicated rejection of divine kingship. Yahweh was meant to be the monarch of Israel. However, they wanted a king like the nations around us. Monarchy in its human form proved to be successful sporadically, but disastrous generally for a developing faith community and nations. Many times, the king would go off chasing other gods, and the people would follow right in his footsteps. So we see the history of the Israeli people, starting off with a narrative. And that narrative, depending on how far you want to go back, started perhaps in Genesis 12 with Abraham and his promise that through him he would be a blessing to many nations. And then we moved, and then his descendants moved to Egypt. And then they were promised their own land, the land of Canaan, 400 years later, as Abraham had scouted out during his lifetime. And when they were taken out of Egypt through the exile, they received the Torah on Mount Sinai. Now this was a framework for them of how they should live their lives in the new promised land and on their way there. And then began their system of worship. They worship God in a way similar to the other ancient Near East people, but not exactly the same. They had one God. They did not sacrifice their children. They only sacrificed animals. They did not have a multitude of gods. Next we see the tabernacle in the desert, in the wilderness, which became a bricks and mortar or a stone, I'm not even sure if there's any mortar, and gold building in the promised land, which takes us to the land, the place of their destiny, the beginning, not the end of their journey, or a beginning. And finally, we see, after a period of judges, we see the rejection of Yahweh as king in place of a man and an earthly king through Saul and then through the dynasty of David.